Suddenly, Claire grabbed Jaewon's hand, her voice pleading, "Wait, please, it might not be too late." Before he could respond, an inspector stepped in, gently pulling Claire away. "Let him go. You need medical attention," he urged, concerned for her condition. But Claire refused to give up, her gaze fixed on Mino. "Just wait a little longer," she implored, hoping there was still a chance to save her friend before any irreversible decisions were made. Later, they gathered at a camp under the watchful eyes of the inspectors. The air was tense as everyone awaited the doctor's verdict. "Do you think she'll survive?" one inspector asked, looking toward the doctor. The doctor, grim-faced, shook his head. "There's almost no hope. If the transformation into an undead continues at this rate, there's little we can do." Jaewon stood silently in the corner, listening to their conversation. His mind was heavy with the weight of the situation when suddenly, a blaring alarm cut through the camp. An alert had been issued, Gorgon Level 4. A minor undead outbreak had been detected within the castle, and all civilians were ordered to evacuate immediately. Panic spread like wildfire as civilians scrambled to flee, many not even understanding the full scope of the danger. Among the confusion, one civilian ran up to an inspector, panicked, and asked, "Where are we supposed to go?" But something was wrong. The inspector's veins bulged grotesquely, his skin turning a sickly shade. In horror, the civilian realized too late, the inspector was already turning undead. The inspector's head jerked unnaturally as spikes erupted from his body, bursting through his shirt. His terrifying, twisted face turned toward the helpless civilian. With a swift motion, one of the spikes penetrated the civilian's skull, draining the life from him in mere moments. Chaos erupted as more undead soldiers appeared, descending on the fleeing civilians. They ambushed from all directions, ruthlessly slaughtering anyone in their path. The once calm camp had become a nightmare. As more fighters arrived to fend off the undead and protect the fleeing civilians, one man stepped forward, wielding a massive, razor-sharp sword. He approached the undead inspector, ready to subdue him. Meanwhile, Jaewon peered out of his camp, assessing the chaos, when he heard Claire's voice beside him. "Are you the one Mino told me about?" she asked, her gaze steady and unyielding. Jaewon turned to face her, but she continued, barely pausing. "You're the one who defies every rule here, aren't you? Judging our world by your own standards, deciding who's human based on nothing more than your whims." She sighed, frustration clear in her voice. "I know you're kind. I've encountered people like you before." She gently placed her hand on Mino's head, her tone softening but resolute. "People who refuse to adapt out of ignorance don't have the luxury of choice here." Jaewon raised an eyebrow. "Are you saying you lack courage?" he asked coolly. Claire hesitated, then scoffed. "Courage," she echoed. "For what? Are you talking about courage to chase noble ideals and higher justice? I'm sure that's what you're after. But let me tell you, maybe you're right, maybe I don't have that kind of courage. But you're dangerous because you do." For a moment, he recalled Mino's words before she fell unconscious, her quiet plea that he wouldn't abandon this world. Claire's voice pulled him back. "The longer you stay here, the more you toy with people's hope," she said, her jaw clenched in frustration. "That kind of false hope destroys people. So, leave if you must, but don't bring more misery by staying." Jaewon stood silent, recalling Mino's wish that he wouldn't give up on this world. Elsewhere, in Carlton's camp, James turned to the physician, concern etched on his face. "How much medicine do we have left?" he asked. The physician looked away, worry deepening his features. "Not much," he replied grimly. "We used most of it to stabilize the castle lord. Supplies are running low." Cursing the dire timing, James glanced anxiously at Carlton, who was rapidly losing his battle against the contamination. He quickly ordered his inspectors to gather every bit of medicine they could find, and they dispersed without hesitation. Meanwhile, Jaewon observed the medicine-making process from a distance, recognizing the horn of the three-horned beast being used in the preparation, a discovery that surprised him. He hadn't realized it could be used for purification. After administering the mixture to Carlton, the team anxiously watched for a response, though they feared even that might be insufficient to reverse the contamination. Carlton's veins bulged ominously as he struggled against the transformation, and his fellow inspectors urged him to hold on just a little longer. At that moment, James noticed Jaewon nearby and was taken aback when Jaewon bluntly asked if there was truly no way to reverse the undead transformation once it began. A glimmer of sorrow flashed in James' eyes as he snapped, "Do you think we'd be fighting this hard if I had a solution?" Without hesitation, Jaewon strode over to Carlton, grasped him by the collar, and slapped him repeatedly, trying to jolt him back to his senses. The inspectors gasped, their eyes widening in disbelief at his audacity. But, through his haze, Carlton's eyes flickered open. He weakly requested a final favor from Jaewon: "If anyone can end this, it's you. Please, kill me. Jaehwan paused, taken aback by the request. He had expected a plea for salvation, but Carlton's steadfast sense of duty prevailed. His voice cracked as he cited Gorgon's Special Act, Article 1, Paragraph 4, any soul succumbing to contamination was to be put to death. Jaehwan could only marvel at Carlton's fierce loyalty, reflecting how, with a few more allies like Carlton, he might have escaped his own entrapment in that twisted nightmare tower, where he had been trapped for 4 decades. As he released Carlton, an alarm blared, announcing that the contamination level had reached a critical 94%, leaving Carlton mere moments from full transformation. Suddenly, the camp stirred as Jahir, captain of the Undead Eradication Unit and a seasoned 5th stage adapted fighter, arrived on the scene. His authoritative voice cut through the tension as he commanded everyone to stand back, his gaze fixed on the struggling inspector. James stood in stunned silence as Captain Jahir entered, his imposing presence causing a hush to settle over the camp. Jahir unsheathed his sword and recited the same article Carlton had mentioned, underscoring its authority. Without hesitation, he informed the group of his grim mission. He was there to execute Carlton Javier, the inspector stationed at the northern checkpoint. Jahir explained the harsh reality of their spiritual realm, where death by age was impossible, but prolonged existence led to eventual spirit contamination. Over time, spirits would erode under the ceaseless pressure, slowly losing themselves. If left unchecked, this contamination would trigger transformation into undead beings. Even the weakest of them were as lethal as a 3-horned beast, and as a result, each of the 4 fortresses of chaos had strict protocols to prioritize the extermination of any undead. Lifting his blade, Jahir prepared to end Carlton's life to prevent an uncontrollable undead outbreak. Just as his sword was about to descend, Jaehwan intervened, blocking Jahir's swing with his bare hand. Jahir's eyes widened, astonished by the strength and audacity of this stranger. Jaehwan remained firm, asserting that Carlton couldn't die yet. He had questions that needed answers. Jahir, still shocked, argued that Carlton's transformation was imminent and that, as a 5th stage adapted player, an undead version of him could unleash catastrophic damage. His orders, therefore, were to prevent such a disaster. Unfazed, Jaehwan calmly acknowledged that he understood the danger but was determined to find a solution. He then pulled out a rare A5-horned beast horn, suggesting they use it as a last resort treatment. The camp physician, recognizing the valuable artifact as a Garnak horn, was taken aback and dared to hope for Carlton's survival. His astonishment deepened when Jaehwan closed his fist around the precious horn, shattering it effortlessly. The physician gaped, marveling at the raw strength required to crush something so powerful and rare, and cautiously clung to the belief that this might, against all odds, save Carlton from his fate. After preparing the medicine, James eagerly administered it to both Carlton and Mino. Relief washed over him as he saw Carlton's contamination gauge stop rising. Overcome with joy, he called out for his senior inspector, his voice trembling with emotion. Meanwhile, the physician examined Mino, his expression darkening with concern. Her body was frail, barely able to resist the undead transformation process. Moments later, a siren blared, signaling that Mino's contamination level had exceeded 95%, marking the critical threshold. Her body shuddered, and blood spilled from her lips as the transformation began. In desperation, someone shouted to fetch Chinhayo, the only one capable of performing the fabled undead slash, a technique rumored to sever contamination itself. The captain of the undead elimination team unsheathed his sword, prepared to end Mino's suffering, but Claire intervened, explaining that Chinhayo's slash might still save her. The protagonist was taken aback, intrigued by the mysterious ability. Yet, to Claire's dismay, the guards informed her that Chinhayo was occupied at the castle and wouldn't be summoned for just this. Shocked by their cold dismissal, Claire clenched her fists as Captain Jahir stepped forward, informing the protagonist that they were out of options and urging him to step aside. Ignoring Jahir's command, the protagonist drew his spirit sword, declaring that if Mino had to die, he would do it himself as she had asked. Channeling his suspicion, he raised his sword to her neck, preparing to deliver the fatal blow. Enraged, Claire struggled against the guards restraining her, shouting for him to stop, demanding to know what he was doing. But he pressed on, focusing energy into his sword, which began to glow with a blinding light. Just as he was about to bring down his sword, an intense energy burst forth from the blade, throwing him backward. When he regained his senses, he found himself in a strange place, disoriented, and wondered where he was, his surroundings unfamiliar and surreal. Beside him, the protagonist noticed a dwarf with a weathered face and sorrowful eyes gently touching Mino's face, murmuring softly, "Poor child." The dwarf, clearly pained, whispered his willingness to help her. But when he glanced up at the protagonist, he jumped back, astonished. "Who are you, and what brings you into my world?" he asked, his gaze penetrating. The protagonist, in turn, studied the dwarf, perplexed by the mix of nobility and an almost childlike aura about him. Sensing a strange energy, he activated suspicion to uncover the dwarf's true nature, only to be alarmed when his skill failed to reveal anything. The thought struck him, is this man the cause of Mino's spirit contamination? Driven by this assumption, the protagonist readied himself to strike, believing it was the only way to save Mino. But before he could act, the old dwarf swiftly drew his own blade and charged, forcing the protagonist to block his strike in defense. Both men stared in mutual surprise, the protagonist astonished that he had deflected the dwarf's blow, and the dwarf mystified at the ease with which his slash was stopped. As they stood locked in place, the dwarf's sword began to crack, fissures spreading not only through the blade but into the very ground beneath his feet. Shock and frustration flickered across his face, and outside this surreal world, Captain Jahir and a doctor watched as a surge of energy exploded from Mino's body, their eyes widening at the sheer intensity. Back inside, the dwarf turned on the protagonist with fury, his voice booming, "How dare you intrude here? Who exactly are you?" He looked down, aghast, at his shattered sword, cursing under his breath. "You broke my four-horn beast blade." Taken aback, the protagonist stammered, "You broke it yourself." The dwarf glared, his fury unyielding, and dropped onto a nearby bench, stewing in anger. Captain Jahir, who'd just arrived, was stunned at the sight of the dwarf and recognized him immediately, Chinhyo, the feared Doctor of Doom. Seeing him here instead of at the castle with the Lord, Jahir couldn't help but ask, "Doctor, what are you doing here?" Chinhyo let out an exasperated sigh, shaking his head as he muttered, "Who cares about the castle lord? I can't let someone so beautiful die right before me." His words hung in the air, leaving everyone around him speechless and curious about what he truly meant, but Chinhyo was in no mood to explain. Instead, he turned sharply toward Jaehwan, pointing accusingly. "What are you going to do now, having ruined my undead slash? You have no idea, only the sword of a four-horned beast or higher can perform that technique." But as he spoke, his gaze fell on the protagonist's sword, and his eyes lit up with fascination. Clearly impressed, Chinhyo asked, "Where did you get such a beautiful sword?" His fingers traced the intricate sheath, crafted from the horn of a five-horned beast, admiring the polished, ornate handle. The dwarf reached out eagerly, "Just where did you find something so precious?" But before he could grab it, Jaehwan held his sword back, pausing. "If you're willing to use this blade," Jaehwan said slowly, "can you save Mino from becoming undead?" Chinhyo blinked, momentarily taken aback. Then he laughed heartily, "You're joking, right? With this sword, I can certainly save her." Jaehwan handed over his weapon without hesitation, and the old man raised a brow, shocked that someone would so easily entrust a stranger with such a treasured sword. He thought to himself, this one's either exceptionally confident in his abilities or hopelessly naive. Setting aside his thoughts, Chinhyo grasped the sword, closing his eyes as he felt the energy pulsing through it. "It's just like you," he murmured, full of unusual energy. Everyone watched with bated breath as Chinhyo lifted the protagonist's sword, his eyes flashing with newfound intensity. As a bright light began to emanate from the blade, Jaehwan wondered if this was the same spell Chinhyo had tried to use earlier. But no, something about this felt different, recalling the moment he used his skill suspicion. "Wait here," Chinhyo commanded with a slight grin, eyes focused, as he dashed toward Mino. The protagonist stood frozen, captivated by the strange world around him as the old man's realm began to disintegrate. The sword slipped from the old man's grasp, and he stumbled, looking noticeably weaker. Concerned, the protagonist asked if he was all right, his gaze shifting to the old man's crumbling surroundings. The elder let out a weary sigh, a hint of bitterness in his voice. "If not for that cursed castle lord, I'd still have enough mana to keep this world stable," he muttered, frustration etched into his face. A faint tremor echoed through the ground, and the surroundings started to fracture. Among the debris, a simple drawing of Mino's smiling face began to fade, and the old man's eyes softened, tinged with sadness. He looked away, muttering, "How humiliating, to fail like this." The protagonist, however, was already on the move, retrieving his sword. The old man's eyes widened as he watched, a faint laugh escaping. "You're an amusing fool," he sneered, amused but disbelieving. "This isn't your world to understand. And an undead slash, do you really think it's just a technique?" The protagonist was undeterred. His mind drifted back to memories of Claire, who had often scoffed at him for his reckless bravery, telling him he confused recklessness with courage. But as he held his sword firmly, something felt undeniably clear. "This is the first time I'm drawing my sword to save someone," he replied, his voice steady with purpose. "So, be quiet and let me try." Just then, ink began to drip from the blade, pooling at his feet before taking on shapes and lines. His memories of Mino surfaced, each one as vivid as the day he had experienced them. He began sketching with his blade, capturing her defiant smile, her fiercely independent spirit, the glimmer of kindness hidden beneath her rough edges. He recalled the way she trusted him, and how she once told him she'd follow him through any storm. Then, he nearly stumbled as he realized he'd forgotten one detail, the small mole under her left eye. Finally, with care, he added that tiny mark. The image was complete. His heart ached with longing as he stared at her portrait, vivid and lifelike as if she were standing before him. And then, softly, a faint voice echoed through his mind, "Thank you for remembering the mole." As the old man's world faded, Mino stirred, her eyes fluttering open as a faint smile crossed her lips. Her spirit contamination level, once dangerously high, was receding steadily. The doctor, his face showing rare astonishment, turned to Jahir and informed him that the contamination had stopped. Mino's undead transformation was no longer progressing. Jahir, still skeptical, watched in disbelief. Meanwhile, Claire rushed to Mino's side, tearfully asking if she was all right. Mino, managing a faint grin, gently asked her friend to stop crying. Standing a few paces away, Chang Hyo observed Mino's revived state with a small, grudging nod. Turning to the protagonist, he muttered, "It seems some of that childish energy was good for something." Eyeing Jaehwan with curiosity, he continued, "But even so, you still look no older than 10 to me. Just who are you, and where did you pick up a move that mimics my undead slash, or rather, undead stab?" Jahir, still absorbing everything, broke in, his gaze shifting from Chang Hyo to the protagonist. "Wait, are you saying Jaehwan's technique is actually similar to the undead slash?" he asked, astonished. Chang Hyo, clearly reluctant to admit it, nodded begrudgingly, affirming that Jaehwan's skills bore an uncanny resemblance to his own. Another doctor nearby was openly astonished. "But the undead slash isn't just a technique," he murmured, his face filled with wonder. "It's not something that any adapted player could ever learn on their own." The implication sank in, Jaehwan might be awoken, like Chang Hyo. Awoken individuals, he explained, were those unaffected by the system's constraints and possessed extraordinary power that could potentially upend the balance of power within chaos. Only a handful had ever appeared in their realm, each a miracle of strength and defiance. Jahir was visibly shaken by this revelation as he tried to comprehend Jaehwan's potential. If he truly was awoken, then he might indeed be capable of wielding the undead slash, just as Chang Hyo could. Still, Chang Hyo lifted his hand, signaling Jahir to pause. "We don't know anything for certain about this Jaehwan," he reminded them all sternly. Jahir looked conflicted, struggling to reconcile the situation. After all, if someone else could perform the undead slash, there might finally be a way to save the castle lord's life, a possibility they could hardly afford to ignore. The tension in the camp shifted abruptly as a figure entered, announcing they had the permission of the inner council to be there. Jahir turned, surprised, and was even more startled when he saw who it was, the captain of the Dark Soul unit, a formidable guardian to the Prime Minister and a fifth-stage adapted player. The presence of the Dark Soul unit was unusual. They had no direct role in dealing with the undead, which was solely the responsibility of the Undead Eradication Unit, and the situation with Mino had already been resolved. To everyone's astonishment, the Dark Soul captain knelt before the protagonist and addressed him formally, introducing himself and offering a respectful greeting. The captain assumed the protagonist was a representative of the Nak Myung clan and requested his company to the castle. Jahir and Chang Hyo exchanged a glance, both equally stunned by this unexpected display. Equally taken aback, the Dark Soul captain glanced between Jahir and Chang Hyo, inquiring what business they had there. The revelation that Jaehwan might be linked to the Nak Myung clan threw them both into silence. Upon arrival at the castle, the Prime Minister awaited them, greeting Jaehwan with a welcoming smile. "Allow me to introduce myself," he began with a slight bow. "I am Jürgen Cheever, Prime Minister of Gorgon Fortress." He then turned to Jaehwan with curiosity and asked, "May I assume you are indeed the messenger from the Nak Myung clan?" Jaehwan calmly denied the assumption, much to the surprise of the Dark Soul captain. Jürgen, however, only smiled knowingly, piecing the situation together. Dr. Chang Hyo, seizing the chance to speak, asked Jaehwan a question, mentioning that stones of fallen souls were renowned for boosting mana but were also symbols identifying one as a member of the Nak Myung clan. Jürgen Cheever raised an eyebrow, looking to clarify the mysteries surrounding Jaehwan's possession of the spirit stones. "If you're not from the Nak Myung clan," he began, "then how did you come by those stones?" He was equally puzzled by Jaehwan's apparent immunity to the stone's effects, as they were known to corrupt anyone's spirit upon contact. Jaehwan calmly produced one of the stones, remarking that he had found them by chance and had experienced no adverse effects while handling them. Intrigued, Chang Hyo asked about the fate of the original owners. Jaewon's straightforward answer, that they were dead, stunned Jaehyun. What exactly do you mean by that? Jaehyun demanded, unable to hold back, but Jaewon responded evenly, he had killed them. Furious, Jaehyun moved to confront him, only for the Prime Minister to intervene, cautioning Jaehyun to hear him out. Jaehyun, though visibly angered, reluctantly stepped back, as did the visibly shaken captain of the Dark Soul unit. Jaewon explained that members of the NAK Myung clan had attacked him first, aiming to steal his spirit horn, forcing him to defend himself. Cheever, listening intently, gave a knowing nod, remarking that such greed was typical of the NAK Myung clan, and seemed convinced of Jaewon's account. Eager to piece together Jaewon's recent actions, the Prime Minister asked him to explain his journey since arriving in chaos. When Jaewon finished his tale, Jurgen recounted it back to ensure he understood. So, you found yourself in chaos through a string of circumstances beyond your control. In the midst of it, you acquired these spirit stones from NAK Myung clan members you encountered. From there, fate led you to this fortress, and in the latest incident, you not only met Dr. Chang Hyo but even managed to replicate his undead technique after witnessing it a single time. That's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more. We'll see you in the next one.